It is now my pleasure, sincere pleasure, to introduce our moderator, Ronnee Ades, who is, as I mentioned, is an assistant professor of professional practice at Rutgers Business School in the Department of Finance and Economics. She previously served as the Director of Career Management for the RBS Master of Quantitative Finance program. Ronnee is the founder of RAA Consulting Services. Prior to joining academia, she spent 30 years on Wall Street with companies such as Market, Bloomberg, FTSE Russell, and Dow Jones indexes. Throughout her career, Ronnee has served as a participant or moderator of many industry panel discussions focused on trending topics such as passive investment strategies, machine learning applications in finance, the developing role of quantamental, I practiced that and still struggled with it, and cryptocurrency. She is an extremely popular instructor in the MQF program. I have no doubt you will adore her as much as her students do. And Ronnee, please take it from here.
Thank you very much. Well, welcome David and everyone who's joining us for the second Signature Leadership Series provided to you by Rutgers Business School. I will start out by saying that I was very excited when asked to moderate this event for two major reasons. One, the RBS focus on enhancing our student education by exposing them to resilient, resourceful, responsible, and inventive leaders is a powerful and tremendous value add for them, and in fact for our alumni and our partnership community. I personally work very hard to include this in my own class curriculum. And secondly, I get to speak with someone whose work is very relevant to my coursework and of interest to our current and former students. A speaker who has had an amazing career in banking, global banking for that matter, was definitely a compelling attraction for me. So here we are, David, and your path in banking has definitely been in the fast lane. Not more than like 3 seconds into reading your bio, you became a managing director at HSBC. So I'm not, or maybe I'm likely overweighting the speed there. So I'm going to turn to you to focus on the particulars as we go through today's event. So David, when looking back, what was the driver for beginning your career in banking and specifically at HSBC?
Okay, thank you, Ronnee. Look, I think you'll find as we talk through some of this, there's been an awful lot of serendipity in my career, and actually how I entered banking in of itself was by some respects by accident. After university in the UK, I decided to travel in Australia. My mother is Australian, and everywhere you went around Asia and Australasia, you saw banks as global brands and things like that. So, you know, I wanted to work for a global organization. I wanted my life to be one that was not bound by geographies and allowed me to sort of see the world and do interesting work. And finance felt like at that point, felt like a good industry in which to do that. And that's absolutely been the case for me over the last 13 or 14 years with HSBC.
So you said serendipity, and I think that's something that, you know, you really can't work at getting. You have to be in the right place, the right time, good luck and all that. But how much would you say the early part of your career was under your control and how much was more circumstantial?
Okay, so it's a great question. I'll start with this. Who you work for is the most important thing, always. And as I've gone through my career, frankly, the other things have become somewhat secondary. And clearly there's a huge amount of luck when you start your career out with who you work with, who you work for, and things like that. But I would say you can be proactive around it. So I was seeking out people who had different views to me on the world, who were prepared to give their time and educate me. The mantra I've always used is sort of hack value before you hack growth. I think they use that now in sort of the fintech world, right? But my early days were all about getting development opportunities and surrounding myself with people who were smarter than me, which wasn't hard to find, but also were prepared to sit and spend the time for me to learn and develop. The other piece of it is I've always tried to put myself where the focus is. That means sometimes you get put in roles that are maybe not the most glamorous, quite stressful, but always going where, at least where the bank or the market or the macro environment was was going to be most impactful. I thought I would learn the most, but it also put me in the center on which to learn.
So for you, in the early days, would you say you had like a career strategic plan, or am I getting overly formal here? But was it some kind of outlook that I want to learn this, and learn that so I can get here, or was it let's take it one step at a time?
Why don't I answer it slightly differently? So I joined HSBC about 14 years ago for a graduate program in the UK. And as I said, the number one objective was frankly to see the world. So my priority right then was to get in, to add value, to add more value than I could take. But ultimately, from a personal perspective, was to see the world and have opportunities to do that. So with that as the sort of personal priority, it then became what was intellectually stimulating for me. So to do that, it was really trying to move around as fast as possible to understand and get the context of what a bank works through. I mean, an organization like HSBC, you know, you've got a marketing department which is bigger than, you know, the top 10 marketing firms probably, you know, in the UK at that point. It was to go through each of the areas, functions and businesses and understand what intellectually stimulated me. For me, it was commercial banking. And the reason for that was the breadth of client type you got to see. While I spent a bit of time in investment banking, you know, it wasn't as intellectually stimulating and as interesting for me. So I started to pivot and to focus on that. My view, and it was a view that was counter consensus at that point, my view was to get deep domain knowledge in one area. There was a big focus across, you know, the financial services market at that point to be a generalist. You know, understand risk, understand commercial acumen, you know, work through the different product types. My view was to get a deep domain knowledge and to start adding value in one specific area. I think one of the prevailing trends we've seen in the financial markets over the sort of last 20 years, and particularly in the 10 years since the recession and in the advances in technology, is much more focus on sort of deep domain knowledge and less generalism than maybe we saw in the industry 40, 50 years ago. I'll be the first to admit that's pure luck, right? I didn't see any trend. I didn't see any trend emerging in the industry that others didn't. I just felt that that was the best thing for my career, and had a view that, you know, getting that knowledge and understanding sort of very narrow but very deep was the best thing to progress, frankly, in my career in the early stages.
Yeah, based on the way you smile, I think some of it is luck, because when you really like what you're doing, it brings a smile to your face, both when you're doing it and when you talk about it. Did you feel that way early on, like I really like this and I want to keep doing this? Or, you know, because I tell students a lot to look at these jobs and don't determine your whole future by that first job.
Yeah,
so
for sure. So look, let's be honest about things. No one wakes up in the morning and goes, my purpose in life is to do banking, right? It's not a purpose or a easily driven purpose through that. So understanding what your purpose within that, more recently, as I've run large teams through multiple countries and jurisdictions, my purpose is to give value to my teams and my clients. So, you know, they become better versions of themselves, whether that's a company growing or an individual progressing in their aspirations and ambitions through the bank. But in those early days, the value driver was solving problems. At a really tactical level, it was, what are the biggest, hairiest problems that I could solve? And by picking the emerging problems, it meant that, you know, my level of experience, my level of understanding wasn't going to hold me back. I feel very fortunate that I joined the workforce at a time when you could teach yourself pretty much anything due to the internet, right? And my opportunity to learn, my opportunity to, you know, create a meritocracy around me, and to go after things where there wasn't, you know, a prerequisite of 20, 30 years of experience, meant that I could solve some of the emerging problems. If I look back and, you know, on reflection, thinking about today's session, you know, that is one trend which I think has allowed me to move potentially faster than the mean in my career, is going after the emerging challenge versus the sort of historical challenge and trying to understand it in different contexts.
I share that experience with you. I always had to reinvent myself, as I have said, by learning what the new problems were and being okay with that. Didn't have to know everything, because I knew you could learn, and you've actually proven that as you go along. So I want to talk about some of those challenges in commercial banking, but I thought maybe we'll move that a little later, and let's sort of move a little more on the progression of your career, because I think that you have a lot of great example or experience from which our students and our audience can learn and appreciate, especially with your attitude too. So let me see if I can pull that out by talking to you a little more about your progression entering into this space. I think you said around 2005. Well, we know what happened between 2005 and 2008. And so I'm interested in how you progressed in terms of your increasing responsibilities and your status at the bank. You can, if you don't mind talking about the financial crisis, debt instruments and things like that.
Yeah, for sure. So the reason I'm in the US is because of the financial crisis. So I was in the UK, as I say, working for the bank, and we first realized we had a problem in our subprime lending franchise here in the US. I'll be totally honest, we clearly had no idea how bad it was going to be, or they wouldn't have sent me, who was 22 years old, to go and review and audit what we had within the portfolio. Look, I think the rest is well played through history. HSBC, along with a number of the other major financial institutions, had large exposure to subprime and near prime debt. And my role within it was to run 60-day collections, and frankly, in layman terms, was to reduce the exposure we had on our books that was going over 60 days, whether that was through securitization, collection, or restructuring mortgage debt, frankly, which was a hugely interesting and diverse role. And as you can imagine, very small numbers of sort of 100 to 200 million became sort of multiple billion-dollar, collections process within a very, very short period of time. And this is where I suppose the serendipity started to come in. People started to see an ability within me to sort of break down complex problems. And at that point, the financial crisis was moving more into sort of corporate debt and things like that. So I moved to New York City and worked both in the investment bank and the commercial bank. We're now sort of around the time of Lehman's, and I was working on the sort of credit portfolio, looking at corporate and institutional names, and frankly, trying to ensure that we didn't lose money. What happened there, again, look, right place, right time in many respects, is I found myself in a position in my career and a position in the organization that meant that many of the people below me unfortunately lost their role, and many of the people above me also lost their role. And that gave me a huge opportunity just to get exposure to activity that I probably wouldn't have got in a sort of peaceful environment, in a context which was, unprecedented at that stage. So, real life learning experiences on activities that maybe I wouldn't have had that experience. I think probably from a personal perspective, looking back, the thing that I did well was, as peaceful times began to sort of come back, some normality came into the market, and actually HSBC moved into growth mode to try and take advantage of the opportunity in the market. I put my hand up and said, look, you entrusted me to look after these portfolios during the previous period. I'd love to have the opportunity to grow it. And I think that was the catalyst for me to run various corporate businesses through HSBC. By the end of that, I was running most of our corporate banking business up the Northeast. I was also running our multinational business, and I'm sure we'll come to the piece of my career that came off the back of that. So all of the international banking that HSBC does, which, as you can imagine, as a firm as worldwide as we are, is a huge business. But that all came from from being in the right place in the right time, but also asking the question. And the way I asked it was, look, I'll take this opportunity, but if this is too much too soon, I'll be the first one to put my hand up and go back to either an individual contributor or a smaller team. But I'd love to have the opportunity to try and to work with you and to build from there. And fortunately for me, we won more than we lost, and it was really a springboard for me to sort of change the trajectory of my career.
So it's interesting. You talk a lot, and I can appreciate that good luck or good fortune has been your partner all along the way. But it's also what you do with that good luck, and the responsibilities that you had in the investment bank division, corporate banking, dealing with multinationals, a lot of stuff that we've been talking about, and the things that you were responsible for running are just not typical of someone that age. So how much of your work, I guess I have a lot of questions around that point. How much of your work was learning on the job versus learning and producing, or what kind of combination of the two? helped you get through that. That's my part A. And then part B is if you could just talk a little more about how you tackled those complex problems. Because again, you're not born knowing how to do that.
Yeah, for sure. So I used to say the prerequisite for everything is work hard. I've changed it now. I may have even said that to you yesterday, Ronnee. But I'm
You
now
changed it today.
it's work smart, right? It's not necessarily work hard, it's work smart. And I think I mentioned already, look, hack value before you hack growth. So when we're building propositions across the investment bank and commercial banking, we're also always hacking value first. Once we've hacked value, it's all about how do we scale it, how do we grow it. And I think that's pretty sound advice for your career. You know, people are always looking to define their career by the number of subordinates, the P&L numbers, number of clients they're running. You know, it's really how do you get the value within your career and value to the organization in the less traditional firms. The other piece that I'm increasingly finding, particularly in the role of the Chief Operating Officer and frankly, the emerging threat that we have across this market is being right is not enough. You can be right and you can be wrong, but also at this point, you know, being consensus and being non-consensus has a huge indicator on your success, both at a macro level and on a personal level. If you can be right and you can be non-consensus, you're going to have a wildly successful career. And you can see, you know, a number of the industries and organizations, you know, blue chip firms who have had sort of exponential growth, the unicorns and the tech companies. You know, it's really around the non-consensus piece that has compounded their growth. And again, I think that's a valuable lesson that people should start bringing into their career. And, you know, the people entering the industry now, my first question to them is, what things have we been doing for 10, 15, 20 years that you have no idea why we do? Right? Because, you know, we do suffer from confirmation biases, particularly in large bureaucratic corporations. And the final piece of this is, it's not always how well you play the game, right? It's actually selecting the right game to play. And, you know, I sort of alluded to it previously, like I am very focused on what part of the bank and where in the bank I am doing my work. I could be doing some amazing work, or we could be doing some amazing work, but it's just not relevant, or it's not salient, or it's not important enough for the organization. And as a byproduct of that, you know, you don't see the progression and the advancement that some others do. And I think that kind of framework is how I look at my career. And I increasingly look at my career as I go forward.
So when you say looking for things that are relevant, am I taking it too far to say those are the things that either the bank is making money on or generating revenues on, or those are the things that the bank can save expenses on?
So in the economic environment we're in, or is emerging right now, the key for us, right, is always how do you drop value to the bottom line. And frankly, the second piece of it, which is increasingly challenging for us, is how do we delight our customers? Banks have been very arrogant, right? And they've been allowed to be. Banking has been a very arrogant industry, and as a byproduct of that, probably hasn't, you know, progressed as it should do around customer experience and providing as much value as it could to the customers. We're seeing that very relevant in the retail space. The thing that keeps me up at night at the moment is not long before that's going to move into the commercial, corporate, and institutional space. And we're already seeing our behavior, our CFO, our head treasurer's behavior being influenced by what they can do on a retail basis. And the level of disruption that can occur from TechFin and FinTech is unprecedented. I mean, it may come up in the Q&A, but I'm happy to give my views on sort of where we will see collaboration, where we're going to see emerging threats, and you know, potentially where the banking industry is going to change. But this is around, our focus is around how we evolve. And there's nothing to say, look, banking has some great tailwinds with it. One being regulation, which is fairly ironic. Actually, the regulation that has meant that we've created technical debt and things in the last 10 years is actually one of the reasons why we won't be disrupted as heavily as some of the other industries like hotels and taxis and the like. But it is around sort of, at this stage in banking, it's around centering yourself around how do you allow us to evolve from those macro emerging threats, because there is a chance that banking could become obsolete, and we should, you know, put that on the table.
Oh, I don't know how I could not ask you to follow up on that. I'm looking at my questions going, okay, those are going out the window. That's a good one. Banking obsolete. I had on your cashless payments and stuff. But yeah, I'd like it. Let's just go right into that. That's a good one. How do you see, what do you mean by that, banking becoming obsolete? And then, so if I were thinking about getting a career in banking, I really am listening to you right now.
Okay, so let's break down the question for a second, because I think retail banking and commercial institutional banking are going to increasingly, differ to a point where you are going to see banks choose where they operate. The universal banking model, to be honest with you, is close to dead. If you look at the stock prices of universal banks, of which there aren't many, HSBC is one, most of them are running at a conglomerate discount, which means shareholders or the market is not seeing the value yet of the network. And companies like Stripe and others are showing that infrastructure, or network infrastructure as we used to look at it, is actually a drag on return and shareholder value. So we're going to see a split between retail banking, commercial and institutional banking, and you can see the level of disruption in the retail banking segment already. Now, do I think that fintech companies or non-traditional NBFIs or TechFin is going to completely displace banking? I don't. What I think it will do is go after the major value drivers of banking. And then it's going to be around how the banks evolve and collaborate within a larger non-traditional ecosystem to survive. Banking is going to be a microservice. Banking won't be something either in the corporate space or the personal space that you do as a monoline activity. It used to be you needed a mortgage, let's keep it simple, you went to the bank. Now you could be, you could be at a open house with an app, and it could put an offer in for the house, get the mortgage and things like that. So we're going to be offering as part of the ecosystem. Now, we have a good brand, a brand built on trust. People still trust banks, even with sort of some of the checkered past over the last 20 years. And it's for us to reinvent ourselves into a more microservice type of business model that hopefully we can own part of, if not all of the platform, and coexist, with some of the non-traditional players. And we're already starting to see that in the corporate space. I spend a significant amount of my time, and an hour already this morning, with tech companies, understanding how do you build mutually beneficial relationships that add value to customers. And we're doing some really, really interesting stuff. What the banks offer as well as trust is, we offer the opportunity for identity. Banking is not seen as identity, but there is going to be a huge emerging industry around digital identity. As everything goes online, banks have the opportunity, financial services have an opportunity to define that and be part of that, and help with regulation, banking as a service, compliance as a service. But the traditional model is looking more and more obsolete, or at least the hypothesis we're working through at the moment is that traditional banking as we see it today, including bankers, it is not going to be there in the next 20, 30 years. What I would say is, with all these things, the emerging trends never happen as fast as you think, but the progress made over a short period of time will still be significant. But yeah, that's what we spend 90% of our time doing, is how are we going to protect the banking model and adapt the banking model around us. And I think there'll be winners and losers in consolidation. And if I'm totally honest, the recent past has only accelerated some of those trends that we're seeing. Changes in customer behavior, changes in employee behavior, and changes in how you want to consume banking services.
So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But then it leaves me thinking, when you talk about that split between retail and commercial or institutional, and then you talked about clients and focusing on what clients or customers, depending on how you view them, want from you. Many of these big banks, such as HSBC, have a brand that sort of has a different meaning to those two different audiences. Do you think to be a leader in the future, they're going to have to choose an audience? They're going to have to choose one or the other, with this sort of going away from the universal model?
They already are. Right? Banks are already starting to choose their model. Now, banks are a complex place, right? You need to balance liquidity requirements, capital requirements, and the sort of universal banking model has occurred because in that traditional framework, and regulation has supported that. One of the things that is going to happen over time is that regulation is going to change for competition reasons. Less so if we've seen it in the US, but if you look at other markets like the UK, Singapore, Australia, regulation, Hong Kong, regulation is changing to allow further competition, and that's going to change to the sort of composition of how banks will be structured going forward. And you can see banks adapting to that as we speak. Standard Chartered have recently done that, DBS in Singapore, and even the US banks, it's less subtle. They still have very large sort of traditional franchises. But if you actually dig into the public filings, where they're investing their money, what businesses they're seeing growing, you can already see the subtle changes that are happening. And as I said at the outset, the industry is becoming more niche. And banks are having to choose where they're going to play, from the very high end of the investment bank league tables all the way down to what is the proposition that goes there. And the race is, how can you get scaled customization? How do you achieve scaled client customization at an effective unit cost?
So it's interesting, if I were looking at banking today, instead of being old like I am and looking back, if I were young and looking forward and saying, the banks did get a little caught by the fintechs, I'd say 5-6 years ago, with them starting or taking the lead on technology and moving faster to meet some of the newest preferences of the especially the retail client. So if I were looking at banking today and I thought, like, well, I get a degree in finance, or I get a quant degree. By the way, I was a quantamental before. I get some kind of degree that I'm really good in math and computer science, or I get I'm really good in corporate finance. Do I have to enter the job market sort of already understanding, like, what are the coming challenges? What is nipping at the heels of banks now? Where can I be part of the solution? And one way would you suggest? I guess my question's really open to you, because I'm thinking it as we go along. I certainly didn't give it to you in our advance questions. But so looking at this, should they look at where the banks are spending money? Should they look at what the fintech companies are doing? Like, where do you got to get in there? Like, what's the best way to do that to sort of position yourself for the future growth?
So if I was starting my career again, my approach to this, and look, it's an opinion of one, and I suspect hugely biased by my career, it would be to enter the banking system within a traditional financial institution to learn and understand the problems and opportunities. And then I would have moved fast into an area that could be a potential solution. There is a huge industry right now, there's a huge gap in the industry right now, from my perspective as a chief operating officer, around people who understand technology and how to deliver products and solutions, and marrying that with the problems and opportunities that banks are facing both internally and externally. And frankly, that's the reason why we've got such a booming consultancy industry supporting banks right now. That's unsustainable. So what we at HSBC are looking for from graduates and programs is people who have got a thirst to understand and learn the problems and the opportunities that exist in banks today, and have the technical understanding that they can provide the solutions there. We took a series of engineers in a couple of years ago, and what we did is we sent them to our operations function. I'm not sure they loved the first 3 months of what they did, but by the end of it, they had all the solutions of how we could fundamentally change operations, use operations research, machine learning to not just get 5-10% efficiency and productivity gains across the operations, but frankly remove all manual intervention and create reinvent effectively how those operations work. That's whether or not you see your career moving sort of in more the sort of startup fintech technology space, or you see it in a more traditional banking and trying to solve the financial services challenges from within, I think learning the problems real time within the industry will stand you on a great foundation on then to offer the solutions and problems. And if I look at people who have left, some of my ex-colleagues who have left and gone into tech companies or started up their own companies, the ones who have been most successful have been grounded in genuinely understanding how a bank works. And I don't think you can do that from outside. You can read around it, but you really can't do it from outside.
Yeah, so that's the other part of learning, I guess. when you look at people who could be successful, I only want to spend another few minutes on the sort of student focus because I want to get into some more current events with you, and I'm trying to budget our time. But in terms of skill sets, I mean, it used to be you could get in as a philosophy major if you wanted to get into banking, and I've had my students read a lot of the books written about those early days, the late 70s and early 80s, when you really could have been almost any major and had an entry into the bank. Today we're in a much more technologically advanced world, and so everybody knows you have to know a little coding. You have to know, but what do you think is value, return on investment, if you will, in terms of an education? What should we be teaching at the universities to prepare these students for the kind of needs? And you definitely feel free to talk about this too. Some of these things were like more soft skills that you were talking about, not just the hard skills.
Yeah, for sure. So again, I think I said this to you yesterday. I have one sticky note in my office, right? A lot going on, but one sticky note, and it's my own personal development plan. And it starts with digital, data, transformation at scale, commercial acumen, and productivity. Right? Those, so when we, those are the skill sets that I see as, the future skill sets that we need. Maybe you can move those around interchangeably, but the way I stated them are in order. Right? Banking is becoming more of a tech industry by the day, if not by the hour at the moment. And we are grossly underqualified and have a huge human capital gap around, a number of those skill sets. And look, I have that sticky note on there because I'm trying to reinvent myself as well. Even in sort of the last 14 years of me in my career, I have built a skill set which is around a legacy banking system and traditional, approach to banking. So, I'm putting in multiple hours a week just around learning, latest opportunities and things like that. And then it is around sort of context. I think those who seem to move fast through their career are the ones, again, who are able to influence others around them, maybe beyond their years. They can move between the hierarchy. Banks are still a fairly bureaucratic and status-driven place, but the ones who sort of move very fast are the ones who seem to be able to influence horizontally and vertically within the organization. So, how you communicate, how you break down complex problems into simple issues, and how you get people behind and fellowship around what you're wanting to do is very, very important. I mean, again, banks are, becoming a little bit more agile in how they approach things and providing people with opportunities to solve problems with seed funding and budgets. What we find are the ones that are most successful in our sort of more junior members of staff are the ones who have got a great vision, can communicate that simple vision and create massive fellowship. People want to work on their projects. They want to be involved in what they're doing. And I think those skill sets, they're the more soft ones, but they're not necessarily the ones people think about as a determinant of success. And increasingly, that is the case.
Well, we'll certainly need to focus on helping develop those, especially where they exist, but they haven't really been nurtured. And so that is something that I think Rutgers spends a lot of time on. At least I know it's a focus of the business school graduate programs. Okay, well, we don't have the whole day left, so I'd like to go to current events because you already talked a little bit about some of this. We sort of wove our way around, but it was just too easy to do. So what are some of the most challenging issues facing big banks today? You talked about legacy issues a bit in technology. We didn't go too much into regulation other than you're mentioning that it will be a driver and continue to be a driver going forward. Cybersecurity. And last, I'd like to save some time for the pandemics, but cybersecurity.
Yeah.
Where are we with that?
Look, there isn't a day that goes by that HSBC is not attacked in some kind of cybersecurity attack. If you were to look at the investment that we're putting into technology, you'd find 40 to 50 cents of every dollar is in some kind of cyber-related security at this stage. I think part of that is reducing and eliminating some of the technical debt that exists. But equally, the trends in that space and staying current on that risk taxonomy is very, very difficult. And the challenge with this, as my IT security officer tells me, is, the person who makes the defense, there's always someone just as smart who can figure out how to unwind that defense. So it is hand-to-hand combat. out there. And look, it's already, a very vast industry, but as customers and consumers move pretty much solely to digital, what we're finding is traditional risks that hit banks, like internal fraud and traditional external fraud and theft and things like that, they're all diminishing fairly significantly. And it's all going into cyber. So, a huge focus for all the banks. What I would say is we are very good at it. We are amazingly good at it. I mean, it is table stakes now for being a bank, is cybersecurity. The downside of it is just too great.
Wow.
And you can see it in the sentiment and the branding analysis. So if you see a bank who has a cyber attack or a data privacy leak or something like that, it's probably the single biggest brand destroyer, value destroyer that you could have. And while many of the financial institutions and insurance companies and tech companies, many of them do recover, it is very, very difficult. And number of inquiries we receive when another bank has a cyber breach or a security issue that hits the media is just phenomenal. It's phenomenal. But yeah, look, it's top of mind every day. One of the briefing papers I get is what are the attacks, what types of attacks, what was our response, etc. It's a minute by minute battle.
I knew it was big, but I didn't realize it was that much of your, such a large proportion of your spending. Wow, that is big. So do your solutions come from internally generated or problem solvers, or do you buy solutions from third-party vendors?
Most of it is purchased. Look, it's a good segue into sort of where I think technology companies, fintech, techfin will play with banks. I think there's a lot of digital theatre, as I would call it, out there at the moment. There's a lot of banks who say, they're being innovative, they're working with these types of companies. But what we're finding, including HSBC, is that's very superficial. Where it works very well is where you partner, whether that's equity involved in that or not, where you partner with these types of companies. And what they offer to us is they offer us two things. One is they help us evolve and change our culture, because they literally are so different to us, and we have to adapt to be like them, and they need to adapt to be like us. And that has a number of benefits over the medium term. The second is, many of them are offering world-class solutions to our problems. And banks, again, and IT departments within banks have been very much build and they will come. We're much more a buy shop now as an industry. Let's go and get the very best that's out there, and then augment it with our own solutions. And I think, that's where you're going to start to see that ecosystem play. I don't think it's going to necessarily be a zero-sum game on some of this stuff. It's going to be more around, what role are people playing within the ecosystem and where banks going to play within that. We've had some, some great but modest successes where, we've taken, small companies, and we are, friend. If you can do it at HSBC, you can do it anywhere. 55 markets, global regulation. It's if you can crack that nut, then there's not much else out there to be solving.
Right. Right. Is the cybersecurity an issue the same around the world? Don't mean to be, okay. So, all right. Well, so I think I'm doing okay. We have 5 minutes left, and I really wanted to save time for talk about COVID-19 pandemic, how it's impacted or affected the bank, and how it's changing things and will change things, because this is something everyone's interested in.
Okay. So I think COVID has accelerated a number of trends that were already there, whether that be for banking or a number of the industries that we support through banking. So if I look at it on a credit risk perspective, the sectors that we are seeing biggest concern or nervousness around emerging were the ones we were probably concerned about anyway. Retail would be a good example, right? The trend in retail. The emergence of people like Amazon is not a new phenomenon, but what we've seen as part of this is an acceleration on some of those factors. And then equally on banking is the same thing. This has accelerated changes in customer behavior. This has accelerated how people want to interact with banks, what they believe, where they should play and where they shouldn't play and add value. It's also accelerated a number of what I would describe workforce and employee trends that we were seeing as well.
Mm-hmm.
You know, HSBC, or at least in my part of the bank, we're very progressive around, you know, we want to create a transient workforce. We want to create a workforce where we don't create any boundaries on where they live, where they work, how they work, you know, as long as we, you know, the levels of productivity are there. And you know, this has definitely done that. And you know, reflecting back on it, the banking sector in general, but you know, I'll say for HSBC as well, we have responded better than we would have anticipated to this. Levels of productivity have been maintained, and in many respects have been increased as part of this. I mean, it's kind of cliche to say, look, you've removed commutes and things like that, but we are seeing productivity gains as a result of, you know, this new way of working. What I think remains to be seen, and there are differing views on this. There's a book called Remote, which talks about how working in a non-traditional office will actually stimulate collaboration and innovation. My personal view is I think the question mark's still there on whether or not working in this manner full time will stifle innovation, will stifle collaboration, and actually what the medium term views this will have from a psychological and a mental perspective. But you know, we are, as most industries, reevaluating our real estate portfolio, looking at how we're going to configure space in the future. But again, it's accelerating trends that were already there. You know, if you think back even as recent as sort of 3 years ago, if you went onto a banking floor, it was a traditional with the offices around the side and a bullpen in the middle. That wasn't the case anyway. You know, now you're seeing coffee shops in the middle of trading floors, and you're seeing all sorts of other sort of innovative ideas to sort of blur the lines between, you know, between a traditional office and the office of the future. So I think it's going to be an interesting one. What we can be sure of is we're going to get it wrong. And, you know, as with a lot of these equations, it's sort of what decisions are we going to take where the risk is, or the downside is mitigated and the upside is, you know, is worth the risk. But, you know, we can see, you know, a number of changes that are coming through in our data that we track, and more qualitatively through people we speak to.
But there is one thing that does strike me as sort of a good way to, from the beginning of our conversation, you're talking about you're wanting to have global experience and to see the world. Well, if we go to a more remote work environment, that is the thing that the young will miss. The thing that taught me so much in my career was the ability to travel around the world, represent my company, meet others from other companies, go out to dinner or lunch with people I didn't know before and learn them better to become a better worker, co-worker, supplier, whatever my role was, to understand problems better. All that seems to me is going to be missing if the world is remote. Doesn't matter where you live, then you won't get to go and see all these other things.
So it's interesting. So this is a discussion point that we have consciously had in the bank. Right, moving people around our organization from geography to geography, from business to business, is one of the reasons why this bank is so great, and why it is fairly typical at HSBC to see people there for 15, 20, 25 years, because it offers, you know, huge amounts of variety, and it has a culture of trust where you don't have to show so much experience to be given an opportunity in a, you know, different context and a different market. And I think, you know, there is an opportunity, if this is done right, that you can actually get the best of both worlds. So I'll talk about myself for a minute. I live in New Jersey, and we have a place, we're fortunate enough to have a place in California. My wife and I are already talking about maybe splitting our year between California and New Jersey. Now, that wouldn't have been a discussion point if it wasn't for this remote sort of situation. And frankly, that I can undertake my job perfectly fine in a remote, you know, in a remote environment. But that can't come at the consequence of people then not being moved from market to market, understanding the context of that piece. Right. So, you know, we, in conjunction with sort of our human resources department, you know, we are very conscious of moving, you know, continuing to move people through from market to market to understand the context of the bank, but also the markets that we serve, the communities we serve, and things like that. So my hope is that one doesn't come at the sacrifice of the other. It shouldn't be mutually exclusive. And actually people get to make, you know, life and career decisions that are even more flexible than maybe they were before COVID.
Right, and they are. I can't help but though thinking that all the things that were partnering with you, all that serendipity came because you were in the right place physically, not just emotionally, but physically, and with people who could create and help you create new opportunities. And so I don't want the young to miss out on that. I really think that's a great part of growing. I hope you get that.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think, you know, one of the pieces that you should debate as a group and on an individual level is, how are you going to adapt your communication style, your personal brand, how you're going to operate in an organization where physical contact, you know, at least in the short term, may not be as abundant as it maybe was a few years ago. And it'll be another one where the people who adapt and understand how you can communicate and drive value in this particular environment will, again, they'll move faster than the mean.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
It's very, very different, right? Like even quite simple things around how do you assess someone's productivity has fundamentally changed, right? It used to be you could walk across the floor and see who was working and what they were working on and have a quick chat with them. We are setting up a virtual manufacturing plan where you use systems like Slack and Zoom that allow us to track productivity and activity work, you know, across multiple jurisdictions. So it's an interesting one, which, you know, people who are entering the workforce should be thinking about, you know, how are they going to do their marketing, their communication, and their personal branding in this type of environment.
I want to be optimistic about it, but I'm a very people person, and I worry that some real good stuff is going to get missed through this electronic transfer of stuff. I really do value the human connection and so let me. I'm supposed to go to questions. I think I'm supposed to put the live audience up for questions now. I think maybe we could have part 2, because I have like so many more things I could talk to you about if they'll invite us. But I think at this point I'm not going to be allowed. So going to the live audience question, and let's see if I'm not too rusty, I'll be able to see some questions. Here they are. Just bear with me as I navigate. I can't see it. Here. So one question that I see, and I can't see them all to pick the best, David, so forgive me, and I selfishly took so much time, but what has been the most challenging change you've had to make since COVID?
So I would say, look, we haven't talked about work-life balance, but it's a question that's typically asked. I have worked very, very hard around compartmentalizing my life to ensure that I'm not working all the time. And when I'm working, I'm working, and when I'm not working and I'm with my family, I've got 2 very young kids, I'm there. I have found that working from home and working remotely has meant that everything has blurred. And some of that is not to do with work, but I feel that, you know, it feels like a constant stream of, you know, Groundhog Day, maybe. And I found that quite challenging mentally. Just breaking up the day, things like commute, which I used to hate. Actually, I'm finding that, you know, there were, you know, unintended consequences that were positive to my mental state and my ability to sort of shut down and things like that. And that, I think, will have some lasting impacts on, you know, my health and things like that. So, you know, that is genuinely being candid with you, the challenge that I'm facing. And actually, when I ask the second or third question of my staff, that's the challenge they're facing as well. And I think, you know, it's a broader one across society.
Yeah, I agree with you. When I was teaching, I knew there was an end to the semester. So I knew at a certain date, this routine that felt like Groundhog's Day would pass and there would be something else to look forward to. When you're working remotely, I wonder, do you have the same way, things to look forward to?
Yeah, so anyway, it's definitely blurred the lines, like BlackBerry's blurred the lines before them. And it's again, it's going to be another one where we're going to just need to adapt to compartmentalize a bit.
It's going to be interesting. Got to keep asking you questions, otherwise I will be fired from this job. So, so someone asked if you could repeat the 4 skills that you talked about that are on your sticky note. I read something very similar from a Harvard Business Review, very similar to what you're saying about, you said digital data and transfer. Sure. I'll let you do it. But
so first one, and look, if it's helpful, I'm happy to share a paper. I mean, look, genuinely, this is my career plan as it is today, and I'm happy to share that around. That's not secret things. So the first one is digital. The second one is data. The third one is transformation at scale. And the scale piece is very, very important. The fourth one is commercial acumen. I'm actually reading it now. And then the fifth one is productivity. And productivity from a banking perspective. So how productive is the bank, but also productivity from a personal perspective. How can I create operating leverage on myself? And, you know, I see just on that last one, I see learning, training, developing myself and my team to be probably the biggest hack for creating operating leverage. If I can get a well-developed, trained workforce, we will achieve greater things than, you know, if we don't spend that time developing capabilities of our people. So that productivity one is on a number of different scales. But again, look, I'm happy to pass you along, and if the audience see value in it, I'm happy to circulate my development plan. You can see all the things I didn't. You can see all the things I didn't achieve.
But that's life, right? That's called being real. Okay, I'm kind of bouncing around because of my failed technology here, so some of my questions are going forward and backwards. So what considerations does HSBC make when deciding on which countries to scale out of?
Okay. So we periodically do what is described as a market participation model, and it looks at primarily the inherent opportunity and then our right to win within that market. So, you know, that assessment is going on. So let's apply that assessment in very crude, simple terms to the US. The US is just still a huge opportunity as an economic market for banks, right? Just a huge opportunity, and one that's growing. And HSBC's market share within it is, you know, very small. We're, depending on what KPI you use or determinant you use, we're sort of the 14th or 16th largest bank in the US. So from an inherent opportunity perspective, this is a great market to be in. You also couldn't be, you know, the world's, you know, #1 international bank without being in the US. So right. That's the reason to be here, even though some of the media outlets would suggest otherwise. Right? There's no way HSBC, we're, you know, one of the largest clearers of US dollar in the world. While that remains the currency of the world, you know, HSBC and everyone else will be here. And then we've got to look at our right to win, and that's a much more complex conversation in the US. Where does HSBC win? We're not going to win necessarily when we go up against a JP Morgan or a Goldman Sachs or a Bank of America. We don't have a branch on every corner. So it's figuring out who our persona is, what our client type looks like, and how do we add value to them. You know, if you are a corporation who is operating in 32 markets, I will go and say that we're probably the best bank, you know, by some significant mile to service your needs globally. And, you know, the 2008 or the great financial crisis showed a lot of treasurers and a lot of corporations that cash is still king, firstly, and transparency to your working capital and your liquidity is one of the most important things going. And what HSBC does as a fundamental is it facilitates global growth and global payments, and it provides transparency to your operations that you can't get when you've got a federation of banks. Sales pitch over.
I liked it. It was interesting. In fact, I'm also writing down for our part 2 conversation. I want to talk to you about emerging markets, but I have to remember this is not just me and you. It's like a bunch of people out there. So I have think time for one more question. So corporate culture is an essential component of high-performing companies. So the question writes, I'm noticing at my own place of work that the culture has been difficult to instill and sustain. Do you have an opinion on this, and what strategies can be applied for remote work?
Yeah, absolutely. So corporate culture is annoyingly nebulous topic for me, who likes things to be, you know, quite binary and can be coded. But your culture and what your culture values is a byproduct of your habits. And there's probably more to it. So it's around how do you instill the correct habits that reinforce your culture. Again, there's a lot of success theatre around good cultures that revolve around, you know, sofas in the office and dogs being allowed in the company and things like that. But when it actually breaks down to, when you look at the employee data, culture is really around, you know, what you stand for as an organization and what habits you you emphasize through. So, like one of the cultural elements that we have in my component of HSBC is that we will take risk, right? Banking is a risk game. And we will take risk, and we will trust people to take personal risk or risk on the bank's behalf where it makes sense, and feel empowered to take those risks and make those decisions. That isn't a culture that has necessarily always been in banking and things like that, but it has to be reinforced. It has to become a habit, and when it goes wrong, it also has to be reinforced. If you give empowerment to people, but when it goes wrong, spirals out of control, then that sends a different message on your culture. We have spent a significant time, and I spend a lot of time personally on reinforcing that culture. I know the role that I have to play in building the culture that we want, but it's definitely got to be anchored around the habits that you're reinforcing day by day, hour by hour.
Thank you. As you recall, I was supposed to stop at around 12:56, so we're already over, and I'm going to put a lot more into part two.
My fault.
No, I'm supposed to be the moderator here, and I ran over. But now I'll turn it over to Margaret now, so that we don't get in any more trouble.
No problem, and you're not in trouble at all. We all enjoyed hearing from you, David, and Ronnee. What a fantastic job you did with moderating. And I have to say there's a lot of enthusiasm around receiving your professional development plan, David. So we'll definitely send that out to people who had registered as part of our follow-up with the video and things like that. So again, thank you so much. And our audience, fantastic questions, certainly enhanced our dialogue today. So thank you. I did want to add a new element today and talk about our 1000 laptop challenge. So this is a new component of our signature leadership series. And it's because our students and their families have experienced financial hardships as a result of COVID-19. And when we return for the fall semester, we don't know how much of a component will remain remote, but they will need the technology. And we'll be seeing corporate sponsors and individual contributors helping to obtain those laptops. We'll be sending out more information, but you'll definitely be hearing more about this important new initiative. Also wanted to mention that our next webinar in this Signature Leadership Series is coming up on Thursday, June 18th. And it features Tom Soderstrom, who is with the NASA Jet Propulsion Lab. It is sponsored by R&D Altanova, and we're working in partnership with the NJ Tech Council and the Arizona Tech Council on the next webinar. So very excited about what we had today and what we have coming up in the future. So just wanted to let everyone know that they'll be receiving a very quick survey as soon as this webinar ends, and we appreciate the feedback that helps us develop our topics for the future. And everyone who registered will receive the archived recording, and you'll be able to see this on social media as well. And all of the information about our program is on our website. Business Insights is where you find the recordings, and alumni/lifelong-learning is where you find the schedule for future webinars. So thank you, everyone. David, Ronnee, and our fantastic audience. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
And David, bye.